September the 19th, 1944. A long, flat sky over the Texas Panhandle, white at the edges with late summer dust. The sun was already climbing as a row of dented metal trays moved down a wooden serving line inside a screened mess hall 10 miles outside the town of Hereford, and on each tray, in the gentle yellow light of unshaded bulbs, sat a thing Hilda did not understand. It was round. It was thick. It sat between two halves of soft, pale bread, with a slice of waxy orange resting on top, melting slowly into the meat. It steamed. There were 37 of these trays in a slow-moving line, because there were 37 of them, captured German auxiliary women, brought across an ocean to a country whose food they had been told did not exist. Hilda stood very still. She had not eaten red meat in 11 months. She had not seen a piece of meat that size in 5 years. Behind her, a low rolling sound was rising in the hall, women weeping quietly, women murmuring in their own language, women turning to each other and asking, almost without sound, whether this was a trick. The smell drifted forward off the trays, fat and smoke and seared onion, and it pulled at something deeper than memory. It pulled at the body. It was not a trick. It was a hamburger. And in the next 3 minutes, the war Hilda had been told to believe in would begin to die, slowly, by the side of a plate, in a place none of these women had ever heard of, served to them by men in wide-brimmed hats and dust-stained boots, who had not asked their permission to do any of this and never would. This is the story of those hamburgers, and of what happened in the months that followed. If you stay with me until the end, I want you to hear the part most history books leave out. A handwritten book, a photograph found 70 years later in a Texas attic, and one sentence, written in pencil on the back of an old camp menu, that one of these women would carry with her for the rest of her long life. So if quiet stories from the back rooms of the war move you, please consider subscribing to keep these forgotten lives from disappearing, leave a like to help this video reach more people, and stay with me until the very last minute. Because what one of these women said, 21 years later, in a lecture hall in a small American university, is the line I most want you to remember. Now, let me tell you who they were. By the late summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht had collected several thousand young women into a network of auxiliary services called the Helferinnen Corps. Helferinnen, the word means simply female helpers, were the radio operators, switchboard girls, communications clerks, code typists, motor pool drivers, and signals staff who kept the German army connected to itself. They were not soldiers in the strict sense. They did not carry rifles, they did not lead attacks, but they wore field gray uniforms, slept in barracks, took the same oath, and followed orders from the same officers. By the standards of the Geneva Convention, when captured in the field, they were prisoners of war. Hilda Becker was 22. Before the war, she had studied to be a teacher of small children in a school outside Dresden. She had a younger sister named Liesel, 14 years old, with light brown braids and a stubborn laugh. Their mother had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1943, a quiet death in a city that was already learning to die more loudly. Their father, a bookkeeper, had been called up in 1941 and had not been heard from since a single field postcard in the spring of 1943, which had arrived smudged and brief. "I am well. Tell Liesel I think of her." By the time Hilda put on the field gray skirt of a Helferin in February of 1944, she was an orphan in everything but paperwork, with a sister hidden in a relative's farmhouse, and a war that had begun to feel like the only home she had. Margaret Weber was 26, the eldest of the group. She came from Hamburg, where she had worked in the office of a shipping firm before the war. She had a long, careful face, a thick braid she kept pinned to the back of her head, and a 14-year-old brother, Klaus, who, she would later say, she thought about every single hour of every single day of her captivity. Annalisa Krauss was 19, blue-eyed and devout, from a small Bavarian village where she had grown up reciting the Catholic catechism while milking goats. Elsa Hoffman was 24, a sharp-tongued secretary from Frankfurt who had volunteered partly out of patriotism and partly because she had wanted to leave the apartment of an uncle who watched her too closely. Käthe Vogel was 23, the daughter of a Berlin University lecturer who had been imprisoned by the Gestapo in 1942 for reasons her family was not permitted to know. Renate Schwarz was the angriest of them. She was 20, and she had lost a brother on the Eastern Front the previous winter, and she did not intend to soften toward anyone wearing an American uniform, ever. They had all been told the same thing. The Americans were beasts. The Americans would not feed them. The Americans would line them up against a wall, or auction them as slaves, or hand them to the British, or hand them to the Russians, which would be worst of all. A propaganda broadcast in the spring of 1944 had warned German women in uniform that capture meant ruin, that the enemy did not regard them as human, that suicide was preferable. Some Helferinnen carried small vials of poison sewn into the hem of a sleeve. Hilda had not. She did not know why. Maybe she had been too tired, by August, to bother dying. They were captured near the town of Verdun in eastern France during the chaos of the Allied breakout. Their communications unit had been pulled back too late and too slowly, and on a hot morning in late August, they had been overrun by a forward column of American infantry. There were no atrocities. There was, in fact, almost no drama at all. An officer with a tired face and red dust on his collar had told them, through a translator from Pennsylvania who spoke a halting, kitchen-table German, to leave their bags and stand in a single line by the side of a road. They had stood there for 2 hours. They had been given water from canteens. They had been told they were prisoners of war and that they would not be harmed. They had not believed any of it. They were moved by truck through ruined French villages, past columns of German prisoners walking with their hands on their heads. They saw a small girl in a doorway hand a cup of milk to a captured Wehrmacht soldier with a bandaged hand, and they saw the soldier's face break in a way they were not prepared for. They were processed in a tent outside Le Havre, given new identification, photographed against a white sheet, asked their names, their ages, their hometowns, their units. The American clerks called them ma'am. None of them knew what to do with that word. By the second week of September, they were aboard a converted Liberty ship called the SS William Calder, crossing the Atlantic in a small group of women housed in a clean compartment near the stern. The crossing took 11 days. They were given 3 meals a day. The first morning at sea, Hilda stared at a tin plate of scrambled eggs, 2 thick slices of buttered bread, and a mug of coffee with real sugar in it, and she felt the first small crack open in the wall of everything she had been told. She did not eat that morning. She watched the others. She watched Renate eat with her head down, defiant, as if the food were a punishment. She watched Annalisa say a quiet German grace before her first bite. She watched Margaret put her bread carefully aside and slip it into her pocket. "For later," the older woman whispered, "because we do not yet know what later will look like." By the 7th day at sea, the women were no longer hiding bread in pockets, because none of them, not even Renate, could any longer believe in a hunger that this ship would not feed. They arrived at the port of Galveston on a hot, salt-thick afternoon. They were processed again, deloused, given clean clothes, and put on a train that traveled west and north for 2 days through country none of them had ever pictured. Texas, in the late summer of 1944, lay open under a sky that did not seem to end. There were no bombed-out churches. There were no women in mourning standing at the edges of train stations. There were children waving from porches. There were paved roads that did not have craters in them. There were cattle, by the hundreds, in pastures wider than entire German districts. Hilda pressed her forehead to the train window and felt, for the first time, something close to panic. The size of this country, she would later write in her diary, was a kind of cruelty in itself. Because every cow they passed was a refutation of every speech she had ever been asked to believe. The camp, when they reached it, did not look like a camp at all. It sat on the rolling brown land outside Hereford, Texas, a small army post made of wooden barracks, a low fence, a flagpole, a water tower, and a long mess hall. There were no guard towers tall enough to seem ominous. There were no floodlights. There were no dogs. The fence was barbed wire, but barely. In places it sagged so loosely that a person could have stepped over it. The guards were not the strong young men Hilda had expected. They were older, weathered, slow-walking men in their 40s and 50s, men with sun-darkened necks and creased hands and an unhurried way of speaking. Texas, by the autumn of 1944, had given up almost every able-bodied man to the fronts in Europe and the Pacific. The men left to guard the German Helferinnen at Hereford were ranchers, cowhands, retired sheriffs, an aging stockyard foreman, and, in one striking case, a former chuck wagon cook the size of a small barn. The captain of the camp was Lawrence Reeves, a slim, fair-haired officer in his late 30s who had been pulled from a desk job in San Antonio and who took the Geneva Convention with the seriousness of a man who had read it 3 times. He met the women on the first afternoon with his hat in his hand. He spoke to them through Lieutenant Owen Brennan, a young supply officer from Nebraska whose grandfather had emigrated from a town outside Cologne and who spoke serviceable, slightly old-fashioned German. "You are prisoners of war," Brennan translated, his voice careful. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, clothed, and given medical care. You will not be mistreated. You will be assigned light work according to your abilities. You will be paid for that work, in scrip, which you may spend at the camp canteen. You may write letters home. You may receive letters. You will be returned to Germany when the war ends." He waited. The women said nothing. They did not yet have words for what they were hearing. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back toward the mess hall, leaving them to stand in the September dust with their cardboard suitcases at their feet and the smell of cattle on the air. Corporal Jesse Tate was the first cowboy Hilda spoke to. He was 46 years old, third-generation rancher, broad-shouldered, with deep crow's feet from a lifetime of squinting at horizons. He had not asked to be a prison guard. He had not, before the war, ever met a German person. He had been pulled into the United States Army Reserve because the regular army had taken his 2 sons and his nephew, and someone had to watch the men, and now, apparently, the women, who had been shipped over from Europe. He approached the new arrivals with the same calm caution with which he approached an unfamiliar horse. Slowly, with his palms turned outward, with a low voice that did not rise. "Y'all gonna be okay," he said, to no one in particular, in a voice none of them understood. "We'll get you settled." He tipped his hat. The women stared. None of them had ever seen a man tip a hat. In Germany, soldiers saluted. Officers clicked heels. No one tipped anything. It was the first of many small American customs that, over the next 9 months, would slowly take apart the picture of the world they had been ordered to carry. That first night, they were shown to barracks that had been freshly swept. There were iron-frame beds with mattresses, real cotton sheets, and folded gray blankets that smelled of soap and sun. There were curtains on the windows. There was a stove. On each bed sat a small toiletries bundle, a bar of yellow soap, a comb, a towel, a tin of tooth powder, and a clean white nightgown. Annalise, the youngest, picked up the nightgown with the careful disbelief of a girl handling a piece of someone else's wedding dress. She held it to her face. She began, very quietly, to cry. "Es ist sauber," she whispered. "It is clean." Margaret crossed the room and put one hand on Annalise's shoulder. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. They had been told, with great seriousness, by officers they had trusted, that the Americans would put them in pigsties. The next morning, before dawn, Hilda awoke to a long, drawn-out cry rolling across the prairie outside the barracks. She sat up. Her heart began to slam. The other women sat up too. Renate, in the bunk by the door, was already reaching for her shoes. "Sirens!" she whispered. "Air raid! We need to—" The cry came again. Long, slow, almost mournful. Not a siren. A man's voice. Somewhere far off across the dark pasture, a cowboy was calling cattle home from a far field. The women sat in their beds in the dark and listened to the cattle answer in a low, ragged chorus. No one moved for a long time. After a while, Hilda realized her hands had unclenched. She had not noticed them clenching. Breakfast that first morning was where the wall began to fall. The mess hall was warm. The light was yellow. The cooks were two men, one a wiry Mexican-American private named Tomas Ramirez, who hummed while he worked, and one an enormous figure who turned when the women entered and revealed himself slowly, with a wide, gap-toothed grin, as Sergeant Earl Buckley. Big Earl, his men called him. He stood 6'4", weighed close to 300 pounds, wore an apron that looked like a bedsheet, and had spent 15 years before the war cooking for cattle drives along the Pecos. He had a voice like distant thunder rolling across an open plain. He looked at the 37 thin, pale young women, and his enormous face went through something very fast, something that, if Hilda had been able to read American faces yet, she would have recognized as grief. He turned back to his stove. He cracked 12 eggs into a bowl in a single sweep of his hand. He poured a stream of cream into the pan. He spoke without turning around. "Tomas," he said, "give 'em the works. Eggs, bacon, the good toast, peaches if we got any, and pour 'em coffee that's strong enough to set them up for the day." Tomas moved fast. Trays came down the line. On each tray were 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of thick bacon, 2 slices of bread, a small mound of canned peach halves in syrup, a pat of yellow butter, and a tin mug of black coffee with a lump of brown sugar in the saucer. Annalise stared at the butter pat for a long moment. "Echte butter," she said. "Real butter." Hilda sat down at a long pine table. She watched Margaret try to lift a slice of bread and fail because her hand was trembling too hard. She watched Cara close her eyes and say a long Catholic grace under her breath. She watched Renate sit down across from her with a face like stone, look down at the food, and then, very slowly, put one hand over her mouth. In Germany, by the autumn of 1944, civilians were living on about 1,400 calories a day. Soldiers' families had reduced bread rations. Meat had become a memory. Butter was something most German children that year had not tasted in over a year. The women at the table had each, in the previous 12 months, eaten 1 full meal every 3 or 4 days, if that. They had survived on coffee made from acorns, on bread cut with sawdust, on potatoes boiled to translucence. The breakfast in front of them, on a wooden table in an American prison camp in Texas, was more food than any of them had seen, in one place, on one plate, in years. It would be 3 days before they understood the worst of it, which was that the breakfast was not a show. It was Wednesday. In Hereford in 1944, Wednesday was a perfectly ordinary day. On the 3rd morning, Hilda was assigned to kitchen duty along with Margaret and Annalise. The American supply officer, Lieutenant Brennan, came to the barracks early, holding a clipboard, and explained in his careful, old-fashioned German that prisoners were expected to work according to ability, that work would be light, that they would be paid 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, and that kitchen duty was considered desirable because it was warm and because the food was, in his words, generally pretty good. He smiled when he said it. The women did not yet smile back. They followed him across the dusty yard in silence, and they entered Big Earl Buckley's kitchen like nuns entering a cathedral. The kitchen was already hot. The stove was already going. Big Earl was already at the long zinc counter, and he did not stop what he was doing when they came in. He looked up, nodded once, and went back to his work, which, the women slowly realized as their eyes adjusted, was the work of pulling more ground beef than any of them had ever seen out of a steel icebox and dumping it, by the double handful, into a vast white-enameled mixing bowl. Hilda stared. The bowl held maybe 20 pounds of beef. 20 pounds. In her last year in Dresden, her family had received a meat ration of 250 grams per person per week, when there was meat at all. The beef in that bowl was enough to feed her old apartment building for a month. "Hamburger day," Big Earl said happily, in English to no one in particular. "Boys love hamburger day." Thomas translated in halting German for the women. "Hamburger tag." Margaret, very quietly, in German, said to Hilda, "This cannot be real. This much meat. For prisoners." Big Earl did not speak German, but he heard her tone. He paused for a moment, his enormous hands deep in the bowl, his face turned slightly to one side. He had heard the Allied news. He had read the dispatches in the Hereford paper. He had a young cousin who had been one of the first soldiers into Buchenwald the previous spring and had come back with letters he could not finish writing. He had a good idea what kind of hunger he was looking at across his kitchen. He cleared his throat. He went back to his bowl. He spoke in a slow, even voice, and Thomas translated into German as he went. "You ladies just watch a little, then we'll put you to work. We season this with salt and black pepper, that's it. Nothing fancy. Onion gets grated, not chopped, otherwise it bleeds out on the grill. Egg, just one, holds it together. Don't overwork it. Hamburger meat ain't bread dough. You knead it too hard, you get a hockey puck. Like this, light hands," he demonstrated. His enormous, scarred hands worked the meat with a gentleness Hilda was not prepared to see. He shaped a patty. He set it on a piece of waxed paper. He shaped another. He looked up at Margaret. "You want to try?" Thomas translated. Margaret hesitated. She stepped forward. She washed her hands in the deep zinc sink. She approached the bowl. She put her hands into the meat. She made a small, involuntary sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob, because her fingers had not felt fresh ground beef in 3 years. She made her first patty. Big Earl looked at it, picked it up, weighed it in his palm, and grinned. "Lady," he said, "you been doing this all your life." Margaret, who had not received a kind word from a man in uniform in 18 months, looked at the floor. The patties were ready by 11:30. Big Earl's grill was a long iron flat top that he had brought from a Dallas hotel kitchen the year before, and he treated it like a holy thing. He oiled it. He waited until a single drop of water danced and vanished. Then he laid the patties down, one by one, with the same care a priest lays down a wafer, and the kitchen filled with the long, slow, somehow ancient sound of seared beef, and the smell of fat hitting hot iron, and the smell of grated onion just kissing the heat. The women, all 3 of them, stood very still and watched. Hilda realized slowly that her mouth had filled with water. Her body had remembered something her mind had nearly forgotten. Big Earl flipped each patty once. He laid a slice of cheese on each one. He covered the grill briefly with a tin lid to let the cheese melt. He toasted the buns face down on the grill in the beef fat. He worked fast, but not in a hurry. He had done this 10,000 times. He sang a little, under his breath, something about a Texas moon. When the trays went out to the dining hall at noon, the women of Hereford Camp received exactly the same lunch as the men who guarded them. 1 hamburger, 1 small heap of crinkle-cut fried potatoes, a small dish of green coleslaw, a glass of cold milk, a wedge of canned peach pie. The guards' trays were not larger. The guards' meat was not better. There was no separate table. There was no separate door. Captain Reeves had ordered on day 1 that all meals in his camp be served on the same line from the same pots, and Big Earl had nodded once and said, "That's how it ought to be." Hilda carried her tray to the table where the women sat. She sat down. She stared at the hamburger. It looked, she would later write, like a small miracle wrapped in bread. She did not touch it. She could not touch it. None of them could. They sat in front of their plates with their hands folded in their laps and stared at the food like children at a christening. Renate broke first. "It's poisoned," she whispered. Margarete did not look up from her plate. "Renate," she said, "why would they poison us? We are already prisoners. We are no use to anyone dead." "They want to test something," Renate said. "Or they want to laugh. Or they want to—" "Look," Margaret said quietly. Hilda looked. Across the hall, at a long table by the door, Corporal Jesse Tate had just bitten into his hamburger, a long, slow, contented bite. A line of beef juice slid out from under the bun and ran down his weathered hand. He caught it with a napkin, grinned at his neighbor, and took another bite. Beside him, old Chester Wilkes, the 63-year-old guard with the silver mustache, was eating with both elbows on the table and his eyes half closed. The Americans were not watching the women. The Americans were enjoying their lunch. Hilda picked up her hamburger. It was warm. It was heavier than she had expected. The bread gave a little under her fingers. She brought it to her mouth. She thought, distinctly, of her mother. She thought of her sister, Liesel. She thought of the words she had heard over the wireless 3 months earlier, in a damp building in northern France, a voice telling her that the Americans would starve her, would humiliate her, would do things she could not bring herself to imagine. She thought of the long line of half-starved German children she had watched, 2 months before her capture, standing in a town square outside Reims, holding empty tin cups in front of a closed bakery. She took the smallest bite she had ever taken. The taste went through her like a current. She closed her eyes. She did not move. She did not chew. She held the bite in her mouth and felt the salt and the fat and the warm bread and the strange tang of melted cheese and the green sharpness of pickle that she had not yet identified, and she felt, with a horror so deep it was almost holy, that everything she had been told about this country had been a lie. When she opened her eyes, she saw that Margaret was crying. So was Annalisa. So, with her face turned to the wall as if she could not bear to be seen, was Renate. Kata had her hands pressed over her mouth. Elsa was staring at her plate as if it were an open grave. They were not crying because the food was good. They were crying because the food was good, and that meant something had been done to them, for years, that they had not yet understood. Every chew was a small, private collapse of a story they had been told about who their enemy was. Every swallow was a question they did not yet have the strength to ask out loud. If the Americans had lied to them about American cruelty— No, wait, that was the wrong way to think about it, and Hilda knew it even as she tried to assemble the thought. The Americans had not lied. The Germans had. About the Americans. Which meant the Germans had been lying about something, which meant the war they had been serving was not the war they had been told they were serving. That night, in the barracks, no one slept for hours. The wind moved softly through the high prairie grass outside, and the air was cool, and the women lay in their iron frame beds and stared at the ceiling. Hilda could hear Margaret breathing, awake, 3 beds away. She could hear Annalise whispering a Hail Mary very quietly in German. It was Margaret who finally spoke. "I keep thinking of Klaus. Klaus was her 14-year-old brother in Hamburg. I keep thinking," she went on in the dark, in a voice as level as she could make it, "of what he ate today, if he ate. The last letter I had from my aunt said the bread was being cut with potato peels, and the children were so hungry they had stopped crying about it. Klaus is 14. He has not had real meat since he was 11, and today I ate a hamburger that would have fed him for a week." Silence. "I am ashamed," Margaret said. "I do not know of what, but I am ashamed." Elsa, from a bed by the wall, said, "My mother wrote in August that she was making soup from potato skins." Annalise, very small. "My grandfather is 81. He is in a village near Passau. The last letter said his teeth had begun to loosen. I think he is starving." Hilda said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "They lied to us. About everything." No one disagreed. No one had the strength. Renate, from her bed by the door, said, in a voice so quiet it almost did not reach the room, "I do not know what to do with this." It was the first soft sentence anyone had heard her say since the day of their capture. The next morning, work assignments were posted on the bulletin board outside the mess hall. Hilda and Margaret were sent back to the kitchen. Annalise was sent to the laundry. Elsa was sent to mend uniforms. Kata was sent to help in the camp office, where Lieutenant Brennan wanted a clerk who could write neatly in both German and English. Renate was sent to the vegetable garden, where, to her irritation, she found that the prisoners were allowed to plant herbs of their own choosing and eat what they grew. The days began to repeat. The days began to add up. 3 days became a week. A week became 2. By the end of September, the women had learned the names of every guard at the camp, and the guards had begun, in the slow, easy Texas way, to learn theirs. Corporal Jesse Tate had figured out that the slim, dark-haired woman in the kitchen was Hilda. He had taken to greeting her in the morning with a nod and a ma'am, which she had finally, after the 5th day, returned with a small nod of her own. Old Chester Wilkes had decided that Annalise, the youngest of them, reminded him of one of his granddaughters back in Lubbock, and he had begun bringing her, every Sunday afternoon, an orange from his own ration. Big Earl Buckley had decided that his kitchen was now a school. "Y'all are going to learn to cook American," he told the women through Tomas one rainy morning, "and I'm going to learn to cook German. Fair is fair." It started with the Kartoffelpuffer. Margaret made them on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, mostly to see if she still could. She grated potatoes with the side of her hand into a chipped enamel bowl, squeezed the water out by twisting them inside a dish towel, mixed in egg and flour and salt and a little grated onion, and she fried them in lard on Big Earl's flat-top grill until each one was the color of a polished penny. She made a stack. She set the stack in front of Big Earl. She stepped back and waited, with her hands folded in front of her apron, the way a young housewife waits for her mother-in-law's verdict. Big Earl picked up one of the potato pancakes. He bit into it. He chewed slowly. His eyes went slightly out of focus, the way the eyes of a man do when he is being moved more than he plans to admit. He swallowed. "Sergeant Weber," he said. He had taken, in the last week, to calling Margaret by her old rank as a small private courtesy. "We got to serve these in this camp for breakfast on Sundays from here on out." Margaret put her hand over her mouth and laughed, a strange, small, choked laugh that turned, by the end of it, into a sob. "Sergeant Buckley," she said in her careful English, "I think you are kind man." He scratched the back of his huge red neck. "Just a cook, ma'am," he said. She shook her head. After that, the recipes began to flow both ways. Annalise taught Tomas her grandmother's spätzle, dragging the soft dough through a slotted board with a wooden scraper, watching the small worms of pasta drop into boiling water, fishing them out with a long ladle, and tossing them in butter and chopped parsley. Elsa contributed her mother's apple strudel, paper-thin pastry stretched over the entire length of the kitchen table, walnuts and raisins and cinnamon rolled into a sleeping log that puffed and crackled in the camp oven. Kata added her aunt's red cabbage with apple and clove. Tomas taught the women his mother's tamales, the husks soaked, the masa beaten with lard until it floated when dropped in a glass of water, the pork shoulder slow-cooked with chilies until it pulled apart with 2 forks. Big Earl taught them barbecue, real barbecue. Brisket smoked 12 hours over green oak, sliced against the grain, served on a slab of buttered Texas toast. He taught them cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet with butter and crumbled bacon. He taught them biscuits, those long, pale, layered American biscuits that Hilda, after the first bite, declared, very seriously, an unsung wonder of human civilization. The Hereford kitchen was now, by any honest measure, the most interesting kitchen in the Texas Panhandle. By mid-October, letters began to arrive. The Red Cross had finally caught up with the women's new location, and one Friday afternoon, Lieutenant Brennan walked into the barracks with a bundle of envelopes tied in twine and called names. Margaret received one letter from her aunt in Hamburg. She read it twice, and then she sat down on the edge of her bed and said in the calmest possible voice, "Klaus is alive. He is thin, but he is alive. He sends his love." Then she covered her face with her hands and did not move for a long time. Annalise received 3 letters from her mother, all in one bundle, all written months apart. Her grandfather, the one with the loose teeth, had died in his sleep in August. Annalise went outside and stood by the fence post at the edge of the pasture and watched the sun go down for an hour. Old Chester Wilkes, who had been on duty that evening, did not say anything to her. He just stood 30 feet away with his rifle slung over one shoulder and made sure no one bothered her. Hilda received nothing. She had given her last known address as the farmhouse where her sister Liesel was supposed to be. She did not know whether the farmhouse still stood. She did not know whether her sister still breathed. She wrote, that night, a careful letter to the Red Cross, asking after a 14-year-old girl with light brown braids and a stubborn laugh, and she sent it through Lieutenant Brennan, who looked at her face for a long moment and said gently in German, "I will mark it urgent." The weeks deepened. The Texas wind began to bite by late October. By the first week of November, the women had been given heavy gray wool blankets, 2nd pairs of socks, and small kerosene heaters for their barracks. The guards began wearing fleece-lined jackets. Big Earl began making chili on the stove every Thursday, a fat, dark stew of beef and beans and tomatoes and dried red chilies that he served with cornbread, and that, in Hilda's diary, would later be called the warm meal that made me know I would survive that winter. The first hard freeze came on November the 11th. The next day, Captain Reeves announced through Lieutenant Brennan that he had received permission for an unusual thing. The American holiday of Thanksgiving was in 2 weeks. He proposed that the camp's guards and prisoners eat the Thanksgiving meal together in the mess hall, not at separate tables, not in separate sittings, together. There was no formal objection. No one in the camp had the energy for one. Thanksgiving morning was clear and bright and cold. The mess hall had been hung with paper garlands and small drawings made by some of the guards' children of turkeys and pilgrims. Big Earl had been cooking since 4 in the morning. There were 3 roasted turkeys. There were bowls of mashed potatoes the size of small bathtubs. There were sweet potatoes baked with brown sugar and small marshmallows on top. A sight that briefly stopped every German woman in the doorway, because in their entire lives none of them had ever seen anyone put candy on a vegetable. There was cornbread stuffing. There was cranberry sauce, ruby red, jiggling slightly. There were green beans with bacon, and there were pumpkin pies. 8 of them, cooling on a long rack by the window. Annalise walked to where old Chester Wilkes was sitting alone at the end of a long table, and without asking anyone, she sat down beside him. She put down her tray. She looked at her plate. She looked at him. "Mr. Wilkes," she said carefully, in English, "today we eat together?" He swallowed. He nodded, twice. He could not for a moment speak. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Today we eat together." Across the room, Hilda watched it happen. She watched Margaret sit down next to Corporal Jesse Tate. She watched Big Earl Buckley emerge from the kitchen with his apron off and his hair combed and a small bowl of cranberry sauce in one giant hand. She watched Renate, pull a chair out for Tomas Ramirez. She watched the room slowly settle into a pattern that, a year earlier, none of them could have imagined. Captain Reeves stood up. He raised a glass of water. He spoke, with Lieutenant Brennan translating, 3 short sentences. "This day," he said, "we give thanks for the food we have. We give thanks for the families we will see again. We give thanks for the peace when it comes, on whatever day it comes. Eat well." He sat down. Corporal Jesse Tate carved Hilda a generous slice of breast meat and laid it on her plate. He said, "Ma'am, this is white meat. Some folks like the dark. Try the white first." She did. She listened with great care while he explained in his slow Panhandle drawl that Thanksgiving was the holiday Americans held to remember the harvest, to remember the help they had received from people they had not at first understood, to remember that the people you sit down with at a table become, by the simple act of sitting, something more than strangers. She listened. She thought for a moment. Then she said, in her careful English, "We have Erntedankfest, Harvest Festival, in Germany. We also give thanks." Jesse Tate's weathered face broke into a slow smile. "See," he said, "maybe we ain't so different." She did not argue. One evening in early December, by lamplight in the barracks, Margaret said the thing that would change the next 5 months of their lives. "We should write it down." The others looked at her. "All of it," she said. "The recipes, what happened to us here, what we saw, what we ate, what we learned, so that someone, someday, knows that this is what a camp could look like, that this is what it could be if men and women decided it would be so." The next morning, Margaret spoke to Lieutenant Brennan. Lieutenant Brennan spoke to Captain Reeves. Captain Reeves, with the small, dry smile of a man who had been waiting for something exactly like this, signed a requisition for 50 sheets of typing paper, 4 pencils, 2 pens, a bottle of ink, and a hardback ledger book with a green cloth cover. Through December and January, the book grew. Margaret wrote out the German recipes in a fine schoolteacher hand. Hilda wrote out the American ones in slightly more careful English. Annalise drew small illustrations in the margins, a sprig of parsley, a slice of lemon, a hand kneading dough. Kata, the lecturer's daughter, wrote short reflective paragraphs in between the recipes. Renate, who had said almost nothing for the first 6 weeks of camp life, wrote, to everyone's surprise, the longest single entry. It was about her brother who had died on the Eastern Front. It ended with a sentence that none of them ever forgot. "I came here hating you for him. I am writing this in your kitchen. I do not know what to do with this except to write it down." Big Earl Buckley wrote the foreword on a single sheet of paper in his short, blocky pencil hand. It said, "We all of us got to eat. Might as well do it together. Might as well make it good." That was the entire foreword. Hilda, on the last page, in pencil, wrote the title, Recipes of Reconciliation. Below it, in slightly smaller letters, she wrote, "For our children, and for theirs." The book ran to 108 handwritten pages. They sewed it together in February with a piece of twine borrowed from the laundry. It was, by any honest accounting, the first thing any of them had created since their capture that was theirs. Winter passed slowly. February brought the heaviest snow Hereford had seen in 20 years. The camp was half buried for 3 days, and the guards and the prisoners worked side by side with shovels to clear paths between the barracks. Tomas got his ear frostbitten, and Annalise rubbed snow on it gently to bring the feeling back. In March, a Red Cross telegram reached Hilda, forwarded from Geneva. It said only, Liesel Becker, age 15, alive, in care of relatives, near Pirna. No further information. Hilda read it standing in the middle of the mess hall, and her knees gave way, and Big Earl Buckley caught her by the elbow with the easy strength of a man who had once caught a falling calf. He said only, "Sit down, honey, you sit down." In April, the apricot trees outside the camp office bloomed, ridiculously, all at once, in 3 days of pink and white. Hilda wrote in her diary that night, "I have not believed in beauty for years. Today, the trees insisted." And then it was the 8th of May, 1945. Lieutenant Brennan came into the mess hall at lunchtime. He was holding a sheet of yellow paper. The room went quiet because of his face. He climbed onto a small wooden box he kept by the back wall for inventory checks. He waited until the last fork was set down. He spoke in English first, and then in his careful German. "Germany," he said, "has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." He waited. For one long moment, no one in the room moved. The Americans did not cheer. The Germans did not cry. They simply sat, very still, in the slow yellow light, and looked at one another across a long room of plates. Then Big Earl Buckley walked out from his kitchen, in his apron, with his big red hands at his sides. He stopped halfway across the room. He looked at the women he had been feeding for 8 months. He looked at the men he had been feeding for 2 years. He took off his apron. He folded it, slowly, the way a man folds a flag. He held it against his chest. "All right then," he said, in a voice that was not quite steady. "All right then. Thank God." It was Margaret who cried first, then Annalisa, then Elsa, then Kata. Renate did not cry. Renate sat very still and stared at the wall, and her hands were trembling in a way that none of them had seen since the first morning in the camp. Hilda walked outside. She stood in the bright Texas afternoon and looked up at the enormous open sky and thought about her sister, alive in a village near Perna, in what was now the Soviet zone, in a country that no longer existed in the form she had known. Behind her, in the mess hall, Corporal Jesse Tate had put his hat on the table and was praying very quietly, with his eyes closed. In the weeks that followed, news of Germany came in like a slow, ugly tide. Hamburg, Margaret's home, lay in fields of broken brick. The center of Dresden, Hilda's home, was gone. Not damaged, gone. 18 square kilometers reduced to ash and bone in the firebombing the previous February. Frankfurt had been scoured. Berlin had been split. The Reichsarbeitsdienst was dissolved. The Wehrmacht was dissolved. The Helferinnenkorps was dissolved. The country they had served had ceased, in any meaningful way, to exist. The camp commander gathered the women one evening and explained gently through Lieutenant Brennan that repatriation would take months. Ships were busy bringing American soldiers home. There was not yet a stable German government to receive them. The Red Cross was working with the American authorities to place each prisoner with relatives, when possible, or in supervised housing in their region of origin. They were not to worry. They were not to be sent into Soviet zones if they had family in the West. They would be given time. And then he said the other thing. In addition, he said, the War Department has authorized a small program. Any prisoner who can demonstrate a sponsor in the United States, an offer of employment, or a willingness to be reclassified as a displaced person may apply to remain in this country. The application is voluntary. It will be reviewed in Washington. We cannot guarantee approval, but the door has been opened, and Captain Reeves has agreed to recommend any of you who wish to walk through it. There was a long silence. Annalisa spoke first. "I have no one left," she said simply. "My grandfather is dead. My mother lives with her sister, who has 6 children, in a village with no work. There is no school for me. There is no church that still has its roof." Margaret was quiet. She had her brother Klaus. She had her aunt. She would go home, she decided that evening, walking the perimeter fence with her hands deep in the pockets of her coat. She had a 14-year-old brother to raise. She would go home. Hilda walked for hours that night. She walked the perimeter twice. She walked across the dark pasture under the enormous stars. She thought about Liesel, 15 years old now, in the Soviet zone, in a country where, by every report, women like Hilda, Helferinnen, communications staff, anyone in field gray, were not being welcomed back gently. She thought about Dresden, which was no longer Dresden. She thought about Corporal Jesse Tate, who had 3 sons of his own and who had said, once, in passing, that his wife had been after him for years to take in a boarder. She did not decide that night, but she felt for the first time that there was a thing to decide. In the end, 9 of the 37 chose to stay. Anneliese, who had no one. Kata, whose father had died in a Gestapo prison 2 years earlier and whose mother had remarried in Switzerland. Elsa, who, in March, had begun a careful correspondence with a Lutheran pastor in Amarillo, who had offered her a job in his parish office. Hilda, who was offered, the next week, a position teaching beginner German at a small college in Lubbock, and who accepted it because the alternative was a country she could no longer find on the map. 5 others, for reasons of their own. The community of Hereford, small ranchers, the Methodist Women's Circle, the Catholic priest, the families of the guards, quietly assembled paperwork, sponsorships, employment offers, and small spare rooms in spare houses. Captain Reeves moved each application through Washington with the patient, grinding insistence of a man who had decided this was the part of his job that would matter. The remaining 28 women, Margaret among them, left the camp in 3 groups across the summer of 1945. Margaret left on a Tuesday morning in July. She wore a gray dress that the Methodist women had given her and carried a single small suitcase. Big Earl Buckley came out of the kitchen in his apron with a paper-wrapped package the size of a brick. It was a brick. It was a brick of cornbread, still warm, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with twine. He pressed it into her hands without a word. She rode in the back of an army truck to the train station in Amarillo, with her hand cupped around the warm corner of that cornbread the entire way. The journey home, in mirror to the journey out, took weeks. Liberty Ship East, Le Havre. Trains through a France that was rebuilding itself, sometimes one beam at a time. Trains through a Germany that no longer had timetables. She reached Hamburg in the 2nd week of September. The address where her brother Klaus had been living, her aunt's apartment near the Ulster, was no longer there. The building was a black shell. A neighbor told her in a careful voice that her aunt and Klaus had been moved to a temporary housing camp on the edge of town the previous winter, and that they were, last she had heard, alive. It took Margaret 3 more days to find them. When she did, Klaus, now 15, was standing in the doorway of a barracks-like building, holding a tin cup of thin soup. He had grown 4 inches and lost about 20 pounds. He did not at first recognize her. She said his name. He looked up. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he set the tin cup down very carefully on a wooden post and walked into her arms. She unwrapped the brick of cornbread that night and broke off a piece and gave it to him. He ate it in 3 bites, and then he sat very still and he began, quietly, to cry. For Hilda, the last day at the camp came in late August. She left her barracks at sunrise. She walked across the dusty yard for the last time. She stopped at the kitchen door. Big Earl Buckley was already at his grill. He looked up. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You teach those college kids how to make a real biscuit. You hear me?" Hilda laughed. It was a wet laugh. "Yes, Sergeant," she said. "Atta girl." She walked out to the truck. Corporal Jesse Tate was driving her to Lubbock. He had her 1 small suitcase already in the cab. He had her copy of the Green Ledger book, Recipes of Reconciliation, wrapped in brown paper, on the seat between them. The original lived in Captain Reeves's office, for the camp's records. Each woman who had contributed to the book had received a hand-copied transcript in Margaret's careful schoolteacher hand before she left. Hilda looked once over her shoulder at the long, flat, dusty yard, at the wooden barracks, at the screened mess hall, at the low, sagging fence that had been the only thing standing between her and the open Texas country, and at Big Earl Buckley standing in his kitchen doorway with his hand raised in a still, slow farewell. She faced front. Corporal Tate put the truck in gear. She did not look back again. The decades did what decades do. Hilda Becker became Hilda Henderson when she married, in 1949, a quiet, kind history professor named Walter Henderson at the small college outside Lubbock, where she had been hired to teach beginning German. They had 2 daughters and, eventually, 3 grandchildren. She became a full professor of German language and literature in 1962. She kept her copy of Recipes of Reconciliation on the top shelf of her office bookcase, between her German-English dictionary and her copy of Goethe's Faust. Margaret Weber raised Klaus on her own. She took office work in a Hamburg shipping firm that was, in many ways, the firm she had worked for before the war, with new owners and a new name and a new ceiling. Klaus grew up to become a civil engineer who rebuilt bridges. He had 3 children. They called Margaret Tante Marga, even though she was their grandmother, because the title made her laugh. She lived to be 91. She never went back to Texas. She wrote to Hilda once a month for 52 years. Annalise Krauss became a registered nurse in Amarillo. She married a Methodist deacon in 1948, raised 4 sons, and worked the surgical floor of a county hospital for 31 years. She never spoke about the camp to anyone who had not been there. Elsa Hoffman eventually moved to St. Louis and worked as a German-English translator for a publishing house specializing in religious texts. She lived alone, on purpose, and died in 1993 in a small apartment full of houseplants and books. Käthe Vogel moved to Switzerland in 1947 to be near her mother. She became an editor at a small literary press in Bern. She translated, late in life, an anthology of Texas folk songs into German. The book sold 312 copies. It is, today, almost impossible to find. Renate Schwartz went home. She married a man she did not love and divorced him in 1959, and then she opened a small bakery in Munich. She named it Hereford. No one in Munich knew what the name meant, and she liked it that way. She kept on the wall, above the cash register, until her death in 2006, a small framed photograph of herself, age 21, standing in a dusty Texas pasture with a tall, older man in a wide-brimmed hat. The man, in the photo, has his hand resting on the head of a brown horse. He is laughing. The man's name was Corporal Jesse Tate. He went back to his ranch after the war and lived another 31 years. He never spoke much about the camp either. But on the wall above his fireplace, in a small wooden frame, hung a single recipe, written in a fine schoolteacher's hand, Margaret's Kartoffelpuffer. His grandchildren grew up eating them on Sunday mornings with applesauce, and they did not know until many years later where the recipe had come from. Big Earl Buckley died in 1961 of a heart that had been overworked for too long by a body that had been too kind to itself. They buried him in his apron, by request, in a small cemetery outside Lubbock. Hilda drove down for the funeral. She did not stay long. She put one hand on the wooden coffin before they lowered him, and she said something very quietly in German that no one heard, and she went home. Captain Lawrence Reeves retired from the Army in 1953. He spent the rest of his life on a small farm outside Houston. In 1968, he gave a long oral history interview to a graduate student from the University of Texas. The transcript is in a folder, in a box, in a basement archive in Austin, and it has been read in the entire time it has existed by fewer than 30 people. In it, he says, of the women of Hereford, "We just fed them. That's all we did. We fed them like we'd want to be fed. It is not, I don't think, a complicated lesson. In the autumn of 1965, Professor Hilda Henderson, formerly Hilda Becker, formerly Helferin, formerly prisoner number 237 of Camp Hereford, Texas, stood at a wooden lectern in front of 140 undergraduates at her college. She was 43 years old. Her hair, by then, was beginning to turn silver at the temples. She had been invited to deliver the opening lecture of a small symposium on the social history of the Second World War. She had agreed only on the condition that she would not be asked to speak in any other panel that day. She set down her notes. She looked out over the dim hall. She began in lightly accented English, with a sentence she had been thinking about for 21 years. "It started," she said, "with a hamburger." She paused. The room waited. "Not because of what it tasted like," she continued, "though I remember exactly what it tasted like, but because of what it meant. Someone in that kitchen, in that dust, in that country I had been taught to hate, had decided that we were worth feeding. Not worth feeding to keep us alive for interrogation. Not worth feeding to extract some confession. Worth feeding because we were hungry. Worth feeding because they were eating. Worth feeding because, on a Wednesday in 1944, it was Hamburger Day, and the boys, as Sergeant Buckley liked to say, loved Hamburger Day, and you do not, in his kitchen, treat one hungry person differently from another." She looked down at her notes. She did not need them. She looked up again. "I have spent the rest of my life," she said, "trying to be worthy of that hamburger. I do not always succeed, but I do not, anymore, believe in the kind of war that asks me to forget that someone, somewhere, might one day decide I am worth feeding." She paused. "That, I think, is the only lesson worth carrying out of any of it." In the spring of 2003, a granddaughter of Corporal Jesse Tate, cleaning out the attic of the old Tate family ranch house, found, inside a cardboard box marked "War Stuff" in her grandfather's handwriting, a hand-bound book with a green cloth cover. The twine that held it together had loosened. Some of the pages had foxed. The ink had faded in places to a soft brown. On the inside front cover, in careful pencil, were the words, "Recipes of Reconciliation, for our children and for theirs." She took it to the local museum in Hereford. The curator, a retired schoolteacher who had grown up 2 miles from the campsite, opened the book with shaking hands. She read the foreword first. "We all of us got to eat. Might as well do it together. Might as well make it good." She closed the book. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she did the only correct thing. She called the small private archive at Hilda Henderson's old college outside Lubbock. She asked whether anyone there might be interested in receiving the only known surviving copy of a hand-bound cookbook compiled in the autumn and winter of 1944 by a group of German women prisoners and the Texas Cowboys who had fed them. There was a long silence on the line. Then a young archivist, in a voice that had become, in the space of 3 seconds, perfectly steady, said, "Ma'am, yes, please. We have been looking for that book for 30 years." Hilda Henderson did not live to see her cookbook returned to her college. She died in 1999 at the age of 77, peacefully, in the same small house outside Lubbock, where she had lived for 50 years, surrounded by her 2 daughters, her 3 grandchildren, and a stack of letters from Margaret Weber, which Margaret had continued to write, faithfully, once a month, for the rest of Hilda's life. But the book came home anyway. It sits today, behind glass, in a small display case in the special collections room of the college library. Beside it, in a plain frame, hangs a single photograph. 37 young women in plain gray dresses, standing on the steps of a wooden mess hall in the Texas Panhandle in the autumn of 1944. Behind them, just visible in the kitchen doorway, stands an enormous man in a white apron with his hand raised in a still, slow wave. None of the women is smiling, but none of them, if you look carefully, is afraid. There is a small typed card beside the case. It reads, "In full." In the autumn of 1944, 37 captured German women were brought to a small prison camp outside Hereford, Texas, where they were fed, clothed, and protected by a group of aging cowboys who had been deemed too old for the war in Europe. Among them was Sergeant Earl Buckley, a former chuck wagon cook, who served them, on their first Wednesday in America, a hamburger. The women had been told to expect cruelty. They received instead a hot meal, a clean blanket, and the unhurried courtesy of men who tipped their hats. 9 of the women chose, at the end of the war, not to return to Germany. This is the cookbook they made. It is the only one of its kind. They called it Recipes of Reconciliation. War is remembered for its violence. War is remembered for its great speeches, its great battles, its great betrayals. But sometimes, very quietly, almost without anyone noticing, war is also remembered for something smaller. A man in an apron, a patty on a grill, a woman, far from home, lifting a piece of warm bread to her mouth and finding, in the small, terrible taste of it, that she had been lied to about her enemy all her life. Maybe peace begins exactly there, in a kitchen, with a meal you did not need to share, with a stranger you decided anyway to feed. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to keep these forgotten lives from disappearing into the dust. Leave a like to help the story reach more people. And in the comments below, I would love to hear from you. Which moment in this video, more than any other, made you stop and feel that you had to keep watching? Was it the first bite of the hamburger? Was it Renate's first soft sentence in the dark of that barracks? Was it Big Earl folding his apron like a flag on the day the war ended? Was it Margaret pressing the warm corner of a brick of cornbread into the hands of her brother in a ruined city? Tell me. I read every one. And I will see you very soon in the next story.